Before I start providing you with a spoken word version of the information relating to the 1967 referendum, I want to draw your attention to the really useful nature of this linked booklet. All of the material in this booklet and the information set out simply and clearly relates to your exam, relates to the idea of rights and freedoms for Aboriginal people. Okay, the 1938 day of mourning. So we've got Aboriginal activists refusing to celebrate Australia Day, which they viewed as Invasion Day. So we've got Aboriginal activism starting, well, earlier than 1938, but 1938 is a very significant day for Aboriginal people, because for many white Australians it was hooray, 150 years of settlement. But Aboriginal people viewed settlement in a very different way, because it had led to massacre, the loss of land, the splitting up of families, incredible suffering. So you can see that these sections, this is section 8. We've got William Cooper, who helped to organise the 1938 Aboriginal Day of Mourning. Important to read about William Cooper. Wonderful man. He's someone that you could write about in relation to Aboriginal struggle for freedom. We've got the stolen generations for section 10. The assimilation policy, which really attacked Aboriginal culture, families, totally disrespected their rights and freedoms. Section 11, the freedom rides. Okay, you've been given work on the freedom rides. I need to see that work, and here is your information. Then we've got Indigenous voting rights, section 13. The Aboriginal people did not get the vote until 1962, and you need to be aware of this information. Okay, 1967 referendum. Since Federation in 1901, there had been 2 sections of the Australian Constitution that had been at the centre of discrimination against Indigenous people. One section, section 51, stated that the federal government was not allowed to make laws concerning Indigenous people. This affected Indigenous rights because the states often had discriminatory laws and the federal government could do nothing about it. So you understand the federal government is the government of the whole of Australia, and then we've got state governments as well. Now, before 1967, if the states wanted to discriminate against Aboriginal people, the federal government, the government that's headed by the Prime Minister, could do nothing about it. Another section, section 127, stated that Indigenous people were not to be counted in the census. This meant that they were not recognised when the population was counted, and that services and infrastructure often would not be delivered to Indigenous communities. So services, for example, would be garbage collection, infrastructure might be roads, medical facilities like hospitals. After pressure from activists, including the 1965 Freedom Riders, which you've learnt about in the earlier section, a referendum was called for 1967. The referendum was asking Australians to vote to remove the words in the Constitution in these 2 sections that affected Indigenous people negatively. Most politicians encouraged a yes vote, and there was a strong yes campaign in the media. Australia has a history of voting no in referenda, but this was mostly a bipartisan referendum, which meant that both sides of politics, most parties certainly the two major parties were saying yes, let's vote to give Aboriginal people full citizenship rights, the same citizenship rights as white Australians. You know, it took long enough. Australia rarely votes yes in a referendum, only agreeing to 8 out of 44. However, the 1967 Indigenous changes were overwhelmingly passed. So, thinking, understanding, sources. Okay, how do you think the referendum reflected or changed attitudes of Indigenous people, other Australians? So reflected, what did it show? That they finally in 1967 realised that Aboriginal people were residents of Australia and they should be given full citizenship rights. Okay, you can have a think about that. But these questions need to be answered, so understanding. You've noticed that some of those words in the passage were highlighted in bold. You need to provide definitions for those words. And you need to answer these questions. So define the words in bold. What was the document that discriminated against Indigenous people? What did Section 51 say? How did this affect Indigenous people? What did Section 127 say? So this information is all clearly provided. It's just a matter of being conscientious and going through that information that's provided. Answer in full sentences, please. Who pressured the government to hold a referendum? When was the referendum going to take place? What was the referendum asking the Australian people to vote on? How did most politicians want people to vote? How often has Australia passed a referendum? What was the result of the Indigenous questions in the referendum? In other words, what was the result of the referendum? And these are source questions. What type of source is source one? What is the motive behind source one? Why was it created? What information about the Constitution does source one provide? What type of source is source two? Who is the audience for source two? Why was source two created? How useful would source 3 be to an historian studying attitudes of Australians in 1967? Give reasons for your answers. Okay. So we've got the sources here. Source 1, source 2, and source 3. Okay. All the best with that. That work needs to be done. It's very important. Thank you. Just give it a go. Do your best and you'll get feedback.